The dawn of 453 AD filtered through the felt walls of the massive tent, painting the air an unsettling crimson. But the silence within was thicker, more terrifying than the pre-dawn gloom. Only yesterday, this tent had echoed with a feast, with flowing wine and the rough songs of warriors celebrating the new marriage of their lord, Attila, whose name made blood run cold from Constantinople to the edges of Gaul. Today, the air hummed with silent terror. On the lavish marriage bed, amid furs and silks plundered from 100 cities, lay the man they called the Scourge of God, the punishment sent for humanity's sins. He was on his back, his face, usually twisted with rage or contempt, was serene, almost childlike. But from his nostrils and mouth, a vast, congealing pool of blood had spread across the white pillows and his beard. The great warrior, survivor of 100 battles, his body a map of scars, had not been pierced by an enemy's sword, struck by an assassin's arrow, or taken poison. He had drowned in a torrent of his own blood, which had gushed from his nose in a drunken sleep. Nearby, cowering in a corner, his new bride, the young Germanic princess Ildiko, trembled silently, her eyes wide with primal fear. And in this grotesque, absurd scene lay the greatest paradox of the age. How could a man who sent hundreds of thousands to their deaths with a twitch of his brow, whose cavalry was a fiery avalanche burning civilization, die such a paltry, such an embarrassing, such a human death? The answer is not just one man's story. It is the story of how a colossus that made the world tremble turned out to be built on feet of clay. How the most invincible power can be washed away, not by armies, but by a thin stream of blood flowing from the wrong vein. To understand how this colossus arose, we must look at the world that birthed him. The world of the 5th century AD, a world cracking at the seams like an old ship in a storm. The Roman Empire, once a single, indestructible monolith, was now not even a shadow, but two shadows of its former self, divided into West and East. In the West, with its capital moved from Rome to the swampy but impregnable Ravenna, imperial power had become a fiction. The real rulers were barbarian generals, schemers, and eunuchs, tearing the treasury and provinces apart. The legions, once the pride and backbone of the empire, had devolved into a rabble of mercenaries from around the world, their loyalty belonging not to the eagle on the standard, but to whoever paid the most gold. The countryside was ravaged by taxes and raids, cities were emptying, aqueducts were crumbling, and ancient marble forums were overgrown with weeds. In the east, in Constantinople, the empire we call Byzantium still held onto its glitter and strength, but it too was consumed by endless theological disputes and palace conspiracies, walled off from the outside world by gold and fortifications. This was a civilization tired of itself, aging, decadent, and corrupt to its very core. And beyond its borders, across the Danube and the Rhine, a different world was boiling. The great migration of peoples, set in motion by a mysterious push from the east, threw tribe against tribe. Goths, Vandals, Alans, Franks, Burgundians, all of them, driven by hunger, fear, or greed, crashed in waves against the borders of dying Rome. It was a giant chessboard, where the pieces moved chaotically. Alliances were made and broken overnight, and yesterday's barbarian ally could be tomorrow's bitterest foe. The world was holding its breath, waiting for a force that could not just shake this board, but overturn it, mixing all the pieces into one bloody pile. And that force was already being born where no one expected it, in the endless, wind-swept steppes, where a life was worth less than a good horse, and the horizon was the only border. The origin of this force, the Huns, was shrouded in a fog of fear and rumor, just like their sudden appearance on the borders of the European world in the late 4th century. To the refined Roman and Greek chroniclers, they were not just another barbarian people, but something infernal, spawn of hell itself. They were described as grotesque creatures, more like two-legged beasts than men. Short, stocky, with huge heads, swarthy skin, and narrow, deep-set slits for eyes. Their faces, according to witnesses, were disfigured by ritual scars, inflicted in infancy so that boys would learn to endure pain before they knew their mother's milk, and so their beards would not grow. They were practically born and died in the saddle. Their bow-legged figures were perfectly adapted for life on horseback, but seemed clumsy on the ground. Their food was half-raw meat, which legend claimed they warmed by placing it under their saddles during long rides. They built no cities and farmed no land. Their home was a wagon, and their only craft was war. Much of this description is surely exaggeration and propaganda, meant to dehumanize the enemy. But it accurately reflects the cultural shock and existential terror the settled, civilized world felt when it collided with the absolute primal energy of the nomads. It was in this world, where the horizon was the only temple and the beat of hooves the only music, that Attila was born around the year 400. He was the son of the chieftain Mundzuk and nephew of the rulers Oktar and Rugila, who had first begun to unite the scattered Hunnic tribes into a single confederation. His childhood was a forge, shaping the character of a future conqueror. He learned to shoot the powerful Hunnic bow before he could talk, to endure thirst and hunger, to sleep on the bare ground under the open sky, and to see every stranger as either prey or an enemy. This world knew no pity, no compromise, and no law but the law of strength. It was from these merciless steps that Attila would forge his guiding philosophy. The world is a pasture, and he is the shepherd, with the right to shear or slaughter his flock as he pleases. But to turn scattered tribes into a single, unbreakable force, brutality and lineage were not enough. He needed a symbol, a myth, something to elevate him above all others and give his power a sacred, divine status. And fate, or perhaps Attila's own brilliant calculation, gave him one. The ancient historian Priscus, who personally visited Attila's camp, retells a legend that was undoubtedly the official version spread by the Huns themselves. One day, a shepherd noticed one of his heifers was limping and leaving a trail of blood. Worried, he followed the track and found an ancient, rusted sword sticking out of the ground, which the animal had grazed. The shepherd, realizing the significance of his find, took it straight to Attila. This was not just any blade. The Huns, like many steppe peoples, worshipped a god of war, whom the Romans identified with their own Mars. They believed that somewhere in the Scythian lands, his sacred sword was hidden, granting its wielder power over all nations and invincibility in battle. Attila, upon receiving this artifact, immediately declared it to be that very sword. He didn't just own it, he became an instrument in the hands of the war god himself. This act transformed him from a simple, if powerful, tribal chief into a figure of messianic proportions. Now, any order he gave was not just the will of a man, but a command from heaven. Any campaign was not a raid, but a holy war. Any resistance to him was sacrilege, to be punished with fire and sword. This story, retold countless times around campfires across the great steppe, became a powerful weapon of psychological warfare. It united under his banner not only the Huns, but dozens of other conquered tribes, Goths, Gepids, Alans, who saw him not as a tyrant, but as a supernatural force that it was futile and dangerous to oppose. Attila had gained what his predecessors lacked: divine legitimacy. He was no longer just Attila, son of Mundzuk. He was Attila, wielder of the sword of Mars, the Scourge of God. And he was preparing to unleash that sword on the heads of those who still considered themselves masters of the world. Yet his understanding of the world was not limited to the horizons of the steppe. Fate had prepared a unique lesson for him, one that gave him the key to his greatest enemy's vulnerability. According to a common practice of exchanging peace guarantees, the young Attila, by one account, spent several years as a high-status hostage at the court of the Western Roman Empire in Ravenna, and perhaps also in Constantinople. For many barbarian princes, this would have been a time of humiliation and hidden hatred. But for Attila's sharp and cold mind, it was an invaluable internship. He didn't just live in the palace. He studied, observed, and analyzed. He saw not only the external grandeur, the marble columns, golden mosaics, complex ceremonies, and lavish feasts. He saw what was hidden behind that facade: the paralyzing bureaucracy, where any important issue drowned in endless approvals; the mortal feud between court factions and generals who hated each other more than any external foe; the all-consuming corruption, where every office, every contract, and even the outcome of a court case was bought and sold. He saw a Roman aristocracy softened by luxury, having lost its martial spirit and disdaining military service. He saw emperors who were mere puppets in the hands of their powerful advisors or dominant women. He studied their language, their laws, their methods of negotiation, where words were valued more than deeds, and deception was considered the highest form of diplomacy. Most importantly, he realized their greatest weakness. The Romans had forgotten how to die for their empire, but they desperately clung to their wealth. They were willing to pay any price in gold to buy off a threat, just to preserve their comfortable way of life. This experience shaped his strategy. He understood that Rome did not need to be conquered in the traditional sense. It didn't need to be settled or assimilated. It needed to be milked, like a fat cow, by threatening it with fire and sword and taking the one thing it still valued: gold. He returned to the steppes not just as a grown Hun, but as an expert in Roman psychology, one who knew every pressure point of his future adversary. And this diploma from the Roman University of Intrigue and Decay proved to be more terrifying than any sword. Returning to his homeland around 434, Attila found the Hunnic state at the peak of its power, but that power was divided. Along with his older brother Bleda, he inherited the throne from their uncle Rugila. A period of joint rule began, which for Attila would be the final test before his ascent to sole power. The two brothers acted as a single engine of destruction. They fully subjugated the surrounding tribes, creating a vast confederation of peoples stretching from the Alps to the Caspian Sea. Their first major act on the international stage was negotiating with the Eastern Roman Empire. These talks were held not in the lavish halls of Constantinople, but directly on the banks of the Danube. As a sign of their superiority, the Hunnic chiefs didn't even dismount their horses, forcing the Roman ambassadors to stand before them. The result was the humiliating Treaty of Margus, which obligated Byzantium to pay an annual tribute of 700 pounds of gold and to surrender all refugees who sought asylum on its territory. This was the first blood drawn from the empire, the first proof that the old world would now live by new rules, dictated from the Hunnic camp. This was followed by a series of devastating campaigns in the Balkans, during which the largest cities were taken and destroyed. Singidunum, modern Belgrade, Nisus, the birthplace of Constantine the Great, and Serdica, Sofia. Attila and Bleda operated with surgical precision and animalistic cruelty, demonstrating to the world a new tactic of warfare, a tactic of total terror designed to break any will to resist. In these campaigns, Attila honed his military skills, but all the while, he remained second. Bleda, as the elder, was formally in charge, and for a man with Attila's ambitions, who already saw himself as master of the world, any shared power was an unbearable burden. He was biding his time, and the shadow cast by his brother's throne was growing darker and shorter. Around the year 445, that shadow disappeared forever. The sources are extremely brief and vague about this event, but behind their sparse lines, one can sense a drama of Shakespearean scale. The chronicler Marcellinus Comes simply states, "Bleda, king of the Huns, was killed by the plots of his brother Attila." Other sources say Bleda died on a hunt. Whether this was a coincidence or a veiled description of a coup, we will never know. But to his contemporaries, and to Attila himself, everything was clear. From that moment on, he was the sole ruler, the Khan, the Kagan, the absolute monarch of the Hunnic Empire. The murder of a brother is an archetypal plot in the struggle for power, from Cain and Abel to Romulus and Remus. For Attila, this was not just the act of eliminating a rival. It was his personal Rubicon, the point of no return. By destroying the only person equal to him in blood and status, he finally severed the last ties that bound him to ordinary human laws and morality. He placed himself above everyone, becoming the very embodiment of power, a living god to his subjects and a demon to his enemies. The colossal energy of the Hunnic horde, all the conquered peoples, all the accumulated wealth, was now concentrated in the hands of one man. His personal will became law for half the known world, and that will demanded more. More gold, more glory, more humiliation for those who still dared to call themselves civilized. By becoming the sole ruler, Attila had unleashed his inner demon, and that demon longed to see Rome burn. Now nothing could stop him. The path to the status of Scourge of God was clear, and it was paved not only with the skulls of his enemies, but with the bones of his own brother. This was the foundation of his throne, and it was built on blood. Having seized absolute power, Attila set to work with tripled energy, turning his horde into the most perfect and terrifying war machine of its era. This was no longer just an army, it was an empire in motion, a multinational legion of the apocalypse. At its core remained the Hunnic light cavalry. Riders who seemed fused with their short but incredibly hardy horses were able to cover vast distances at unseen speeds, appearing where they were least expected. Their main weapon was the composite bow, asymmetrical and reinforced with bone plates, which surpassed all known counterparts in range and penetrating power. The Huns could fire accurately at a full gallop, using the Parthian shot tactic, showering the enemy with a cloud of arrows while feigning retreat, then wheeling around to attack again. This swarming, buzzing, and lethal force demoralized even the most steadfast infantry. But Attila understood that cavalry alone could not take fortified cities, and here his pragmatic genius shone. He did not destroy the peoples he conquered, he put them to work. Heavily armed Gothic infantry fought in his army, alongside units of Gepids, Rugi, Siri, and other Germanic tribes. Each nation fought with its own familiar weapons and formations, giving Attila's army incredible tactical flexibility. But the most astonishing thing was that Attila, a nomad, had created a powerful siege train. He actively recruited Roman engineers, deserters, and captured masters, who built siege towers, battering rams, and ballistae for him. This was what allowed him to shatter the walls of cities that had been considered impregnable for centuries. His empire, unlike Rome's, had no clear borders, no bureaucratic apparatus, no unified culture. Its only law was fear, and its only binding agent was the unquestionable authority of Attila himself. He ruled through a system of hostages, took the daughters of vassal chieftains as wives, and demanded not taxes, but tribute, in gold, weapons, and warriors. It was a parasitic empire that lived by robbery and extortion, and to exist, it had to constantly fight and expand. And Attila aimed this hungry machine at the richest and, as it seemed to him, most vulnerable target. The first massive strike of this new and strengthened armada fell on the Eastern Roman Empire, on the rich and populous provinces of the Balkans. In 447, using the pretext that the Bishop of Margus had helped loot Hunnic royal tombs on the north bank of the Danube, Attila moved his army across the river and began a campaign of total annihilation. This was no longer a series of raids, but the systematic devastation of an entire region. The Hunnic wave rolled from the Black Sea all the way to Constantinople. More than 70 cities were taken by storm and either burned to the ground or forced to pay monstrous ransoms. Chroniclers describe with horror the slaughter at Nisus, where the river Nishava ran red with blood, and the streets were so choked with corpses that it was impossible to pass. The Byzantine field army, which tried to repel the Huns at the river Utus, was utterly crushed. Attila advanced to the very walls of Constantinople, which had recently been partially destroyed by an earthquake. Panic erupted in the city. However, the Hunnic leader, knowing full well he couldn't take such a cyclopean fortress, didn't even try. His goal was not conquest, but humiliation and plunder. He set up camp in the suburbs and waited for ambassadors from the Emperor Theodosius II. The negotiations that followed were the height of humiliation for the once great empire. Under the new treaty, the annual tribute was nearly tripled to 2,100 pounds of gold, plus a one-time payment of 6,000 pounds for past offenses. The empire was forced to cede a vast territory south of the Danube to the Huns, creating a buffer zone 5 days' journey wide. This campaign didn't just enrich Attila, it cemented his reputation as an unstoppable force, before which even mighty Byzantium had to bow. He had shown the entire world that the era of Roman dominance was over. The era of fear had begun. It is from this period, between devastating campaigns, that we get our most valuable and vivid portrait of Attila, left to us by the Greek diplomat and historian Priscus of Panium, who visited the Hunnic leader's camp as part of a Byzantine embassy. His notes are a unique window into the barbarian world, free of the usual Roman disdain. Priscus describes a massive nomadic camp, more like a city of tents and wooden houses, bustling with life. He was struck not only by the military might, but by the complexity of Hunnic society. At a feast held for the ambassadors, he saw a stark contrast. The warlords and honored guests drank from gold and silver goblets, ate from silver platters, and showed off their silks and jeweled weapons, all plundered in their campaigns. But Attila himself sat on a simple wooden throne, ate meat from a plain wooden plate, and drank from a wooden cup. His clothing was made of rough cloth, clean, but without any adornment. His weapons were not inlaid with gold. This austerity was not an act. It was a demonstration of a different kind of power. He was above all the tinsel, all the luxury that the Romans chased. He was the embodiment of pure, naked power that needed no external trappings. Priscus describes him as a short man with a broad chest, a large head, small eyes, a thin beard, and a flat nose, a typical Hunnic appearance. But his gaze was piercing and commanding. He spoke little, but his every word was law. He rarely laughed, but his smirk made his followers tremble. He was sharp, instantly deduced the embassy's secret purpose, an assassination attempt, and held the conspirators up to icy contempt. This portrait shatters the stereotype of the primitive savage. Before us stands a complex, intelligent, calculating politician, absolutely certain of his right to rule the world, who masterfully used both brute force and subtle diplomacy to achieve his goals. He was a barbarian only in origin. In the scale of his personality, he was the equal of any Roman emperor, and perhaps even their superior. However, standing in the path of this absolute ruler was one man who was not just his enemy, but his dark reflection, his only worthy rival on the great chessboard of the era. This man was Flavius Aetius, the supreme commander, Magister Militum, of the Western Roman Empire. Their fates were strangely intertwined. Aetius, himself a Roman of noble birth, had also spent several years of his youth as a hostage among the Huns, long before Attila's rise. He learned their language perfectly, understood their mentality, and mastered their tactics. He could drink kumis with them, ride the steppes, and was valued by them as a brave warrior. It was this closeness to the barbarians that allowed him to build a dizzying career in Ravenna, relying on units of Hunnic mercenaries whom he repeatedly brought into Italy. Aetius eliminated his political rivals and effectively became the shadow ruler of the West under the weak emperor Valentinian III. For nearly 20 years, he was the last of the Romans, the man holding back the chaos by cleverly pitting one barbarian tribe against another, making alliances, betraying, fighting, and buying loyalty. He and Attila were two sides of the same coin. Both were products of an age of decay. Both despised the effete Roman aristocracy, and both valued only strength and personal loyalty. They knew each other, perhaps even shared a mutual respect. For a long time, they maintained a complex, almost partner-like relationship. Aetius paid Attila tribute to keep him out of Italy, and Attila saw Aetius as the only force capable of maintaining some semblance of order in the West, from which resources could be extracted. But both men knew their peaceful coexistence was temporary. They were two predators, too large for one forest. Sooner or later, their paths would have to cross, not at the negotiating table, but on the battlefield. And the pretext for this decisive clash came from the most unexpected of places, the women's quarters of the imperial palace in Ravenna. History sometimes takes the strangest turns, and the catalyst for the greatest invasion of the 5th century was not greed for gold or strategic calculation, but the desperate act of a single woman. Her name was Justa Grata Honoria, and she was the sister of the Western Roman Emperor, Valentinian III. Ambitious and imperious, she held the title of Augusta, but her life was a gilded cage. After taking part in a court conspiracy, her brother, seeking to strip her of all political influence, decided to marry her off to an elderly and insignificant senator. For Honoria, a woman of imperial blood, this was a fate worse than death. In desperation, she took a reckless step. In 450, she secretly sent her faithful eunuch to Attila's camp, along with a letter begging the mighty Hunnic king to save her from the humiliating marriage. She sent him her personal ring. What exactly she meant, we will never know. Perhaps it was just a cry for help, an offer of an alliance, or a plea for money. But for Attila, with his straightforward barbarian mindset and his genius for exploiting any opportunity, the message was unmistakable. A ring was a proposal of marriage. And if a woman of imperial blood offered herself as a wife, she must come with a suitable dowry. Attila immediately sent envoys to Ravenna with a shocking demand. He accepted Honoria's proposal and, as her rightful dowry, demanded no less than half of the Western Roman Empire. To the Roman court, this was unheard-of audacity, an absurd and insulting ultimatum. Of course, they refused. Honoria was severely punished and hastily married off. But they didn't realize that their refusal had just given Attila exactly what he was looking for: a perfect, impeccable casus belli, a reason for war. Now he would march on the west not as a plunderer, but as a scorned groom coming to claim his rightful inheritance. The ultimatum was rejected, and Attila's hands were untied. He had, in his own mind, the moral right to begin the war he had likely been planning for a long time. A mobilization of unseen scale began. From every corner of his vast empire, from the banks of the Volga to the Pannonian Plain, warriors flocked. Hunnic cavalry, Goths under their own kings, Gepids, Siri, Rugi, Alans, Burgundians, a whole sea of peoples began to move. According to the estimates of ancient historians, which are likely exaggerated but reflect the scale of the terror, between 300 and 700,000 men gathered under Attila's banners. In the spring of 451, this gigantic avalanche crossed the Rhine and poured into Gaul, the richest and most prosperous province of the Western Empire. This was not just an invasion. It was a plague of locusts, burning and devouring everything in its path. Attila waged a war of psychological annihilation. He deliberately cultivated his image as the Scourge of God, a merciless heavenly punishment. His horde moved with incredible speed, giving the enemy no time to regroup. One by one, the cities of Gaul fell. Divodurum, modern Metz, was taken by storm, its population completely massacred, and the city burned to the ground. The same fate met Trier, Cologne, Reims, and Tongeren. The terror the Huns spread preceded their army. Legends born in those days told of slant-eyed demons who spared neither women, nor children, nor priests at the altars. It was said that where Attila's horse trod, grass never grew again. This terror was a calculated tactic. It paralyzed the will to resist, forcing cities to open their gates without a fight, hoping to buy their survival. Attila was marching toward the heart of Gaul, to the city of Aurelianum, Orléans, the strategic key to the crossing of the Loire River and the path south into the lands of the Visigoths. It seemed nothing could stop this river of fire, and the fall of the West was only a matter of time. However, at this critical moment, his old rival, Aetius, showed all his will, energy, and diplomatic talent. Realizing that his remaining Roman troops and Federate mercenaries were not enough to stop the Hunnic armada, he took a desperate step. He decided to build a coalition of last resort. He traveled to Toulouse, the capital of the Visigothic kingdom, to persuade their king, the old and powerful Theodoric, to join him. The task was almost impossible. The Visigoths were traditional enemies of Rome. They themselves had sacked the Eternal City in 410. They hated and despised the Romans. But Aetius found the only argument that would work. He convinced Theodoric that Attila was a threat not only to Rome, but to all peoples of Gaul. That after he finished off the Romans, he would destroy the Goths as well. After long and difficult negotiations, the old king agreed. Other tribes joined this alliance: Franks, Burgundians, Saxons, Alans. For the first time in a long time, old enemies united in the face of a common, existential threat. This diverse army marched to intercept Attila, who was already besieging Orléans. Learning of the combined forces' approach, Attila, not wanting to be trapped against the city walls, lifted the siege and began to retreat eastward, looking for a suitable place for a decisive battle. He found it on a vast plain in Champagne, known as the Catalonian Fields. Here, at the end of June 451, the two greatest armies of the time collided. This was not just a battle, it was a clash of worlds. On one side, Attila's multinational horde, the symbol of the nomadic steppe. On the other, the last alliance of a dying ancient civilization and the Germanic kingdoms settled on its lands. The fate of Europe was to be decided in a single bloody day. The Battle of the Catalonian Fields became one of the largest and bloodiest battles in pre-industrial history. It was a true battle of nations, where dozens of languages, cultures, and fighting styles met on one field. Aetius and Attila, the two greatest generals of their age, played out a complex tactical game. The key point on the battlefield was a hill that dominated the center. Attila, hoping to use his numerical advantage, began the battle late in the day, so that if he failed, he could retreat under cover of darkness. He directed his best forces to capture this hill, but the Romans and Visigoths got there first. A fierce struggle began. Attila placed his Huns in the center of his battle line, with his more reliable German allies, the Ostrogoths and Gepids, on the flanks. Aetius, in turn, placed his Roman troops on one flank and the Visigoths under King Theodoric on the other. In the center, facing the Huns, he put the unreliable Alans, surrounding them on both sides with his best forces so they could not flee. The battle turned into a gigantic meat grinder. According to the historian Jordanes, a stream flowing through the field overflowed its banks, swollen not with rain, but with the blood of the fallen. In the thick of the fight, the old Visigothic king, Theodoric, personally leading his men in a charge, was thrown from his horse and trampled to death by his own cavalry. His death did not break the Goths. It only fueled their rage. Theodoric's son, Thorismund, led a desperate charge against the Hunnic center. Attila's warriors faltered and began to fall back to their camp, which was fortified with a circle of wagons. Attila himself was surrounded. It seemed his fate was sealed. At this critical moment, with the coalition's victory so close, Attila showed not only tactical genius, but an unbreakable will. Barricaded in his Wagenburg, a mobile fortress of wagons, he ordered a huge pyre of wooden saddles to be built in the center of the camp. According to witnesses, he was prepared to throw himself into the flames rather than be taken alive. All day, his archers rained arrows from behind their cover, preventing the allies from breaking through. Night fell, and the battle subsided. Both sides had suffered horrific losses. The field was strewn with tens, and by some accounts, hundreds of thousands of bodies. The next morning, Aetius faced a difficult dilemma. His Visigothic allies, having found their king's body, were crying out for vengeance and demanding a final assault. But the Roman general, showing incredible political foresight, reasoned otherwise. He understood that the complete destruction of Attila would lead to the overwhelming empowerment of the Visigoths, who would instantly turn from allies back into Rome's greatest threat in Gaul. For him, the ideal outcome was a situation where both his enemies, the Huns and the Goths, were weakened and balanced each other out. Therefore, he convinced the new Visigothic king, Thorismund, to return immediately to Toulouse to secure his throne before his brothers could seize it. Left without his main strike force, Aetius did not risk storming the Hunnic camp alone. He allowed Attila to leave. Attila retreated, but it was not the flight of a routed army. He left in good order, maintaining his dignity and threatening to return. Thus, the Battle of the Catalonian Fields ended in a strategic draw, but with enormous consequences. The myth of Attila's invincibility had been shattered. For the first time, he had been stopped, but for the Scourge of God himself, this was not a defeat, merely an annoying delay and a terrible insult, for which someone had to pay, and he already knew who his next victim would be. The humiliation at the Catalonian Fields only inflamed Attila's fury. He spent the winter licking his wounds and gathering a new army, and the very next year, 452, he fell upon Italy. This time, he was even more brutal, even more merciless. His goal was revenge. He met no serious resistance. Aetius was unable to gather another coalition army. His Germanic allies, believing the main threat had passed, had gone home. The invasion began from the north, and the first city to stand in the Huns' path was mighty Aquileia, considered one of the largest and richest in the empire, the true gateway to Italy. The siege was long and difficult. The city resisted desperately, and at one point, legend says, Attila was ready to retreat. But then he saw white storks carrying their young from the city roofs. He interpreted this as an omen. Even the birds knew the city was doomed. He ordered a new, decisive assault. Aquileia fell. What happened next became a symbol of Hunnic cruelty. The city was not just plundered, it was methodically and completely destroyed, erased from the face of the earth, its population massacred or led into slavery. Attila wanted not one stone left on another, so that the very memory of the city would disappear. Legend holds that the few survivors from Aquileia and nearby settlements fled to the deserted, marshy islands of the Adriatic lagoon, where they founded the first settlements that would eventually become Venice. Thus, paradoxically, Attila's act of absolute destruction indirectly led to the birth of one of the most beautiful and unique cities in the world. After the fall of Aquileia, terror gripped all of northern Italy. Mediolanum, Milan, Patavium, Padua, Verona, and other cities surrendered without a fight, paying massive ransoms to avoid destruction. The road to Rome, defenseless and demoralized, was open. Attila's horde moved relentlessly south, down a road paved with ash and fear. In Rome, panic reigned, comparable only to the terror during Hannibal's invasion. Emperor Valentinian III and his court fled from Ravenna to the Eternal City, not to organize a defense, but to be ready to flee further, to Sicily or Africa at a moment's notice. Aetius, with his small army, could only shadow the Huns from a distance, daring not engage in open battle. It seemed the fate of the city that had been the capital of the world for centuries was sealed. Nothing could save it from the rage of the Scourge of God. And it was at this moment of desperation that one of the most mysterious and dramatic events in history occurred. An unusual delegation set out from Rome to meet Attila, who was camped somewhere on the Mincio River near Mantua. It included high-ranking senators, but it was led not by a general or a politician, but by the spiritual leader of the Christian world, Pope Leo I. It was a meeting of two worlds, two ideologies. On one side, Attila, the pagan, the embodiment of raw material force, a man whose god was a sword, and whose law was violence. On the other, Leo, an elderly, unarmed clergyman, a representative of spiritual power, armed only with a cross and the strength of his faith. They met, and a conversation took place whose contents will forever remain a mystery. Christian chroniclers, of course, describe the event as a miracle. According to their version, during the conversation, Attila had a vision. Floating in the air behind Leo were two imposing figures in apostolic robes, St. Peter and St. Paul, who threatened the pagan with heavenly retribution if he did not obey their vicar. Stunned by this supernatural event, Attila humbled his pride, promised to leave Italy, and make peace. Whatever the true reason, the fact remains. After this meeting, the unthinkable happened. Attila, standing one step away from his greatest triumph, from sacking the richest city in the world, turned his army around and left. The mystery of Attila's retreat from the gates of Rome is still a subject of fierce debate among historians, who look for more pragmatic explanations than divine intervention. And there are several, most likely a combination of them. First, the ransom. Pope Leo and his companions undoubtedly carried enormous gifts from the imperial treasury and the church coffers. Attila, as we know, always preferred gold to bloodshed if the price was high enough. The sum offered to him may have been so colossal that he deemed it more profitable than the unpredictable sack and plunder of a huge city. Second, strategic and logistical problems. His army had been in Italy for months. The hot, unfamiliar climate and marshy terrain were spreading disease. An epidemic, perhaps plague or dysentery, had broken out in his army, which was overcrowded with men and livestock, and it was killing his warriors by the thousands. Furthermore, supply problems had begun. Having devastated northern Italy, the horde was beginning to starve. Aetius, though he avoided a direct fight, was constantly harassing the Hunnic foraging parties. Third, the threat of an attack from the rear. While Attila was in Italy, the new Eastern Roman Emperor, Marcian, who was more decisive than his predecessor Theodosius, had sent an army across the Danube and begun to ravage the undefended Hunnic lands. This created a direct threat to Attila's supply lines and his main base in Pannonia. Thus, Attila's decision to retreat may not have been an act of submission, but the cold, calculated decision of a pragmatic general who weighed all the risks. He had received a huge ransom, demonstrated his power by bringing Rome to its knees, and was now retreating to preserve his army and deal with problems back home. But for his contemporaries, for the entire Christian world, it was nothing short of a miracle, one that definitively established the moral authority of the papacy and created a legend that has lived for centuries. Attila left, but he left undefeated, taking with him not only Roman gold, but an aura of supernatural terror. Attila returned to his camp in Pannonia, in the territory of modern-day Hungary, at the absolute peak of his power and fame. He had achieved what no barbarian warlord before him ever had. Both halves of the once great Roman Empire were his tributaries. The emperors in Ravenna and Constantinople trembled at the mere mention of his name. His domain stretched from the Caucasus to the Rhine. He was the arbiter of the fates of dozens of peoples, the uncrowned emperor of the barbarian world, the true master of Europe. He could rightly consider himself the lord of the world. He was planning new campaigns, another against Constantinople, to punish Emperor Marcian for his audacity, or perhaps against the Visigoths in Gaul, to avenge the Catalonian fields. It seemed his energy and ambition were limitless, but it was precisely at this zenith of his glory, when he seemed invulnerable to any external force, that an invisible and most merciless enemy began to undermine him: his own body. A life spent in endless campaigns, battles, and constant nervous tension had taken its toll. Added to this was the typical barbarian lifestyle of feasting and heavy drinking. Chroniclers note that while he displayed austerity in public, in his inner circle he did not shy away from wine. He likely developed hypertension. Perhaps he had liver and vascular problems of which he was completely unaware. The shadow of death was already hanging over him, but it was not the shadow of an enemy's sword. It was an internal, physiological shadow that all the gold he had captured could not dispel. He who had conquered the world was powerless against the processes taking place in his own body. And fate was preparing one last, bitter irony for him, staging his exit from life as a crude farce following a great tragedy. In the spring of 453, while preparing for a new major campaign, Attila, who already had a vast harem of wives from many nations, decided to celebrate yet another wedding. His new bride was a girl named Ildiko, or Hildiko, renowned for her beauty. By one account, she was the daughter of a Germanic king. By another, a Gothic or Burgundian princess, taken as a hostage. The wedding was celebrated on a scale worthy of the master of the world. A grandiose feast was held, attended by chieftains from all the subject tribes. Wine flowed like a river, music played, and warriors praised their leader and his new wife. Attila himself, contrary to his usual reserved behavior, was reportedly unusually cheerful that day and drank heavily, giving himself over to the revelry. This feast was meant to be a symbol of his inexhaustible vitality, his masculine power, his unending victories. He, already an old man by the standards of the time, was taking a young beauty as his wife, as if defying time itself, defying death. He was showing everyone that he was still full of strength and ready for new conquests. No one present in his tent that evening could have imagined they were seeing their fearsome lord alive for the last time. No one could have guessed that this celebration, this symbol of triumph and life, would be the prologue to the most absurd and humiliating death for a great warrior. Fate, as if mocking him, had chosen the marriage bed, a place of love and procreation, to cut his journey short in the most prosaic and disgusting way. The great drama was reaching its finale, which felt more like a cruel joke. A deep analysis of Attila's physical and psychological state in his final year brings us closer to solving the mystery of his sudden and strange death. Imagine the colossal pressure this man was under. He was not just a general. He was the axis upon which his entire fragile empire, stitched together from different scraps, revolved. He personally decided everything, from planning military campaigns to settling disputes between subordinate chieftains. His brain was constantly working in a state of maximum tension. Any wrong decision, any weakness, could lead to the immediate collapse of everything he had built. This chronic stress, which lasted for decades, inevitably took a toll on his cardiovascular system. Modern medicine might call it executive burnout, but in the 5th century, it was simply a slow self-immolation. Added to this psychological burden was the physical strain: endless rides, life in campaign conditions, and wounds sustained in battle. And all of this was exacerbated by the lifestyle typical of the barbarian nobility. Feasts that lasted for hours were not just entertainment, but an important political ritual, a way to seal alliances and display generosity. Enormous amounts of alcohol, often undiluted wine, were consumed at these feasts. Chronic alcohol abuse could very likely have led to cirrhosis of the liver. One of the most dangerous complications of cirrhosis is portal hypertension, which in turn causes esophageal varices, the swelling of veins in the esophagus. These veins become thin and fragile, and their rupture can trigger a massive, often fatal, hemorrhage. Thus, Attila's body was like an overloaded machine, running at its absolute limit. Outwardly, he was still fearsome and mighty, but inside, a time bomb was ticking. All that was needed for disaster was one last push, one jolt to upset the fragile balance. And that jolt was his final wedding feast. And so, the end came. After the rowdy feast, heavily drunk and exhausted, Attila retired with his young wife to the wedding tent. The next morning, his commanders, worried that their leader had not emerged for so long, grew concerned. At first they hesitated to disturb him, but as the sun climbed high and still no sound came from the tent, their anxiety turned to fear. They began to call his name loudly, then to pound on the tent, and finally, getting no answer, they dared to burst inside. The scene that met their eyes was shocking. Attila was lying on his back on the bed, dead. Everything around him was soaked in blood, but there was not a single wound on his body. The girl, Ildiko, sat in a corner, her face hidden by a veil, weeping silently, whether from grief or terror. Upon inspection, it became clear that the unthinkable had happened. The great conqueror had suffered a nosebleed in his sleep. Due to his heavy intoxication, he had not woken up and had not turned over. Lying on his back, he had simply suffocated on his own blood. A blood vessel, weakened by pressure and alcohol, had burst, and a thin stream of blood had done what all the legions of Rome could not. It had killed the Scourge of God. The irony of this death was monstrous. The man who had shed rivers of other people's blood had drowned in a few handfuls of his own. The warrior whose name was synonymous with battle and violence had died quietly, in his sleep, on his wedding bed. The Lord of Nations, who decided the fates of empires, fell victim to a common physiological failure, from which no man is immune. It was a death that devalued all his greatness, reducing his epic life to a pathetic end. It was the last and cruelest joke fate ever played on him. Of course, such a prosaic death for a figure of this magnitude was bound to spawn doubts and conspiracy theories. Rumors of murder spread immediately. The main suspect, naturally, was the young widow, Ildiko. Who was she really? An innocent victim, paralyzed with fear at the sight of her dying husband, or a cold-blooded assassin, an agent sent by Attila's enemies? The poison theory seems unlikely, as Attila ate and drank from common vessels at the feast, and poisoning only him would have been extremely difficult. But perhaps she used some kind of slow-acting poison, or a substance that induced bleeding. Or more likely, she could have played a passive but decisive role. Seeing her drunken husband begin to bleed, she might simply have done nothing, not tried to wake him, not turned him on his side, not called for help. Whether out of fear or acting on someone's orders, she simply waited for him to die. Anyone could have been behind such a plot. For instance, the last Roman, Aetius, who knew full well he couldn't stop another campaign by Attila, or the Byzantine Emperor Marcian, whom Attila had promised swift revenge. The elimination of the Hunnic leader was the greatest dream of the entire civilized world. However, despite the appeal of the murder plot, most modern historians lean toward a natural death. The scenario of a ruptured esophageal varix, brought on by alcohol intoxication and hypertension, perfectly explains all the circumstances. Sudden, massive bleeding from the mouth and nose with no external signs of violence. In the end, it doesn't really matter. Whether Ildiko killed him or his own lifestyle killed him, the result is the same. The paradox remains. Invincible to the swords of his enemies, he was completely vulnerable to the weaknesses of his own body. His death was the most convincing proof that, for all his supposed divine status, he was merely mortal. Attila's funeral was as grand and terrifying as his life. The Huns, mourning their leader, did not shed tears, as was the custom for other peoples. Instead, following their tradition, they cut their faces and sheared their hair, so that the greatest of warriors would be mourned not with womanly weeping, but with the blood of men. His body was displayed for viewing in a silk tent in the middle of the steppe, as the best horsemen of the Hunnic horde circled around it, chanting funeral dirges praising his deeds. Then came the burial itself, carried out with maximum secrecy, so that the ruler's grave would never be found and desecrated by his enemies. His body was placed in 3 coffins, one inside the other, like a nesting doll. The first, inner coffin, was made of gold, symbolizing the tribute he forced the world to pay him. The second was of silver, symbolizing the wealth captured in his campaigns. And the third, outer coffin, was of simple, strong iron, symbolizing his unbreakable will and his victories in battle. At night, in secret, the coffins were committed to the earth. All the slaves who dug the grave and took part in the burial were immediately killed, so they could never reveal its location. There is even a legend that to hide the grave for certain, the Huns dammed a river, dug the grave in its bed, and after the burial, let the water flow back in its original course. The location of this grave remains unknown to this day. Archaeologists and treasure hunters have been searching for it for centuries, but in vain. Attila took his secret with him, dissolving into the very earth his horse's hooves had trampled for so long. But the most astonishing thing was that his entire empire was laid to rest with him in that secret grave. Attila's death was a death sentence for his empire. It turned out that this entire colossal construction, which had terrorized half the world, was held together exclusively by his personality, by his genius, his will, and the fear he inspired. He had numerous sons by different wives, and they immediately began a ferocious struggle for the inheritance. The empire, as one historian aptly put it, was torn apart like a family estate. Each son wanted to rule his own part, but not one of them possessed even a tenth of their father's authority or ability. Seizing the opportunity of this infighting, the former vassals rose in rebellion. The Germanic tribes, Gepids, Ostrogoths, Heruli, united under the leadership of the Gepid king Ardaric, who had been one of Attila's most trusted advisors, and revolted. In 454, just 1 year after Attila's death, at the Battle of Nidau in Pannonia, the combined Germanic forces annihilated the Hunnic army. Ellak, Attila's eldest son and official heir, fell in the battle. It was the beginning of the end. The Hunnic Empire disintegrated with the same speed it had arisen. Some of the Huns were destroyed, others retreated back east, to the Black Sea steppes, where they gradually dissolved among other nomadic peoples. Attila's other sons died in subsequent battles or became minor chieftains, posing no further threat. The people who, for half a century, had been Europe's greatest nightmare, simply vanished from the pages of history, as if they had never been. This was the clearest proof that Attila's empire was not a state in the usual sense of the word. It had no institutions, no laws, no common culture that could outlive its creator. It was, quite simply, a giant warband, a horde, held together by the will of one man, and when that man died, the bond snapped, and it all crumbled to dust. And so, we return to our central question. How and why was the Scourge of God, before whom Rome trembled, killed by a nosebleed? Now the answer, in all its layered irony, becomes clear. Attila's death is not a historical accident. It is a fitting end, a perfect metaphor that reveals the essence of his entire phenomenon. He could not be defeated from the outside, because he was the outside, a force of nature, born of the chaos on the borders of a dying world. He was a symptom of the disease that had infected Rome, not its cause. The legions could not stop him, because he did not play by their rules. His speed, cruelty, and unpredictability broke every canon of ancient warfare. His enemies could not kill him, because he had built an impenetrable wall of fear and personal loyalty around himself. But he proved to be utterly defenseless against an internal enemy. That enemy was his own body, his human nature, which he so despised in others and ignored in himself. His body, worn out by decades of stress, alcohol, and superhuman tension, betrayed him at the most unexpected moment. The central dramatic paradox, the invincible warrior struck down by a trivial ailment, is resolved. Attila was invincible only as long as he played on his own field, in the world of violence and strength. But he was also part of the biological world, which obeys its own, far older and more relentless laws. And that law states, every organism, no matter how complex or powerful, has its limits. His death was not a defeat, but rather a disqualification for breaking the rules of life itself. He burned himself out in the fire of his own ambition, and the last thing left of that inferno was a trickle of blood that put a full stop on his great and terrible story. In the end, the story of Attila goes far beyond the biography of one barbarian warlord. It is an eternal reminder of the fragility of any power built solely on violence and fear. Attila created an empire that was his exact reflection. Vast, swift, all-consuming, but lacking an internal structure, incapable of creation. It was doomed to die with him, because it was him. His legacy is a paradox. On one hand, he remains in the memory of European nations as an absolute evil, a herald of the apocalypse, a destroyer and a killer. His name became a byword for barbaric cruelty. On the other hand, his invasions, like a forest fire, cleared the ground for new growth. They finished off the agonizing Western Roman Empire, accelerating its fall. They set in motion the peoples who would eventually build a new, medieval Europe on Rome's ruins. His story is a parable about how even the most powerful tyrants, who believe themselves to be gods, remain slaves to their mortal flesh. They can move armies and destroy cities, but they cannot command their own hearts to beat, nor can they stop the blood from flowing from a ruptured vessel. Attila's death from a nosebleed is not just an irony of fate. It is a fundamental law of history, which states that every colossus that seems eternal will one day fall. And often, it doesn't take an enemy's sword or the wrath of the gods. All it takes is one small, fragile vein, bursting at the wrong time and in the wrong place. And in that simple, almost medical truth, there is more philosophy than in all the chronicles of his great victories.